Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Well, this weekend we start a new series. We're going to be going through the Old Testament book of Job over the next 3 weeks, and we're going to be calling this series "Seeing God." And I think it's going to be exciting because it's just this day and age. It's sometimes tough to see God and in everything that's going on in our lives, but we're going to study the life of Job, and here's what we're going to discover together: that when everything in Job's life falls apart, in that moment he sees God more clearly than he ever has before. And my prayer for us is that that would be true in our lives as well. And when everything seems to be falling down around us, that we will be able to see God more clearly. And before we jump into the book of Job, I want to tell you about this game. I like to play games. All right, I'm a gamer guy, but and you can download this game on your phone, on your iPad or whatever. I'm not saying you should do this, but I don't recommend it actually. But this game is called Pocket God. And it's part of a genre of games called God games, where you get to play the part of God, right? And the way this game is advertised is what kind of God would you be? And so in this game, Pocket God, you get to play the part of God, and where you control everything for these islanders, primitive islanders that they live on this island. And if you want to, you can make the sun come close to them and it burns them up. Or you can pull the sun away and they all freeze to death. If you want to, you can flick them off the island and they get eaten by sharks, or you can shake it and it's an earthquake, right? And the point of this game is you're in control. You're in control of the world. And if you want to torture them, you can torture them. But the game brings up some actually interesting questions about the true God that I think some of us are wondering, even if we don't wonder them out loud. Questions of, is God really in control? Does God really care? Because it can feel sometimes like he's out of control. And if he's out of control, then we might as well just make the most of our time on this island and not worry about anything. Or if God is in control, then maybe he doesn't care. Because it doesn't feel, at least right now, that he's too concerned with what's going on for a lot of us. So it can either feel like God is powerless to help, or he's powerful, but he doesn't care. Either way, it leaves us feeling pretty discouraged and more than a little bit helpless, right? And so in the midst of this pandemic that we're going through, I know some of the questions you're asking is, God, are you really in control? And even the way you pray probably has changed a little bit since all this has happened. And you have more questions for God, and you maybe don't have as much confidence in your prayers. And when you ask if God is in control, I know some of you ask that, and it's more of an accusation, because you got your own history and your own personal stories that make you wonder if God is really in control. But I know for a lot of you, when you ask about God being in control, it's a sincere question. Like, you really hope he is. It just doesn't feel like it right now. And so when we first learn of Job, he's coming to that moment in life when he's going to ask him some of those questions. Now, at the beginning of the book of Job, chapter 1, Job is living with what we might call the American dream PCV, the American dream pre-coronavirus, right? Because his life is comfortable, and it's easy, and his kids are healthy, and his businesses is booming, and everything is going well for Job. And then in chapter 1, it just kind of all starts falling apart. And so as a servant comes on the scene and says to Job, Job, all your sheep and all your goats and all your livestock, they've been killed, along with all your servants. I kind of noticed that the servants were after the flocks, like which was more important, the flocks or the servants. And now look, in those days, there's no insurance for businesses, right? There's no insurance. There was no government bailout. There was no small business loans that he could count on. I mean, Job woke up that morning and everything was normal and predictable. Everything felt under his control, but by the time he went to bed that night, it was a wreck. He lost everything, and he was probably at the place where he thought, it can't get any worse than this. Like, everything is falling apart. I've lost my riches, my business. But just as he's thinking that, another servant comes in on the scene. And the servant says, Job, I don't know how to tell you this, but your sons and daughters and all your children, they're at your oldest son's house, and a great storm came, and the house collapsed, and all your children have died. And so he's lost everything. He never could imagine that this would happen to him. And in Job 1:20, after he's received this news, it ends differently than you might expect. It says that Job stood up and he tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and he fell to the ground to worship. He worshiped. And he said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord had taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. See, so in this moment of loss and grief, he still worships. He still acknowledges God's power and God's sovereignty, and he puts his faith and his trust in God. But see, things don't get better from there. He begins to experience even more pain. He begins to experience physical suffering and illness, and then he's got people around him who are just tearing him down. Like his buddies come around and he says, hey, Job, hey, what did you do to make God mad at you, right? Like, why did you do to make him mad? You must have done something to cause all this. And his wife comes in and tries to convince Job that God has turned his back on him. And he says, Job, just curse God and die. Let's get this over with. Just be done with him. And so Job keeps his faith, though. But he starts to ask some questions. And he begins to question God. And goes, God, do you really care? God, are you really in control of this situation? Do you see what's happening to me? Because it doesn't feel like it right now. And there's a picture called the pale blue dot. And this picture was taken at the edge of our galaxy. It's kind of hard to see up there. You can lower the lights for a second so it's a little easier to see. I mean, it's so far away, right? And it's 4 billion miles from Earth is where this picture was taken. 4 billion miles. And the Voyager turned and took this picture of Earth. And you can see there in this picture, Earth is just a dot. It's just a tiny dot, ray of light. And it looks like a speck of dust. And the question is, are we just a speck of dust on a speck of dust in the Milky Way? And that this speck of dust is flowing through the universe? Because if that's true, then it's really easy to think that God must not care very much about what's happening on this pale blue dot. I mean, if that's all we really are, then do you really think that he is concerned that you can't pay the mortgage this month? I mean, do you really think that with everything that's happening in the universe that he knows about the marriage problems that have surfaced in the midst of this pandemic? Do you think he knows about the difficult breakup you went through and the loneliness you feel? Or what about your kid's learning disability? You're not qualified to be a stay-at-home homeschooling parent, but yet that's where you find yourself. Does God know? Does he care? And what about the pandemic? I mean, maybe that's a blip on his heavenly radar too. But does he really care? Or are we alone in this? And I think these past months we've been forced to acknowledge some things. We are more vulnerable and we're more fragile than we would ever like to admit. And so Job asks God some questions. But I think he's asking him these questions not just for himself. I think he's asking them for you and me. God, do you really care about the cancer? God, do you really care about my unemployment? God, could you please just explain yourself to me? Could you just explain the infertility? Could you explain the child abuse? Could you explain the rejection? And while you're at it, could you explain the pandemic? And in Job chapter 38, God has had enough of these questions from Job, and now he speaks to Job. But listen, he doesn't answer Job's questions. He asks Job questions. He doesn't say, okay, Job, you got some questions? Let's work through these one at a time. I'll give you these answers. No, he says, Job, I'm going to ask you some questions. And these questions have a way of putting some things into perspective for Job and for us. And so just as we have questions for God, maybe these questions of God to Job are good questions for us to wrestle with as well. So in Job 38:2, God begins his questioning this way. He says to Job, who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Who is this that pretends to know what they don't know? Who is this that thinks they understand what they can't possibly understand? He says to Job, brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you will answer me. See, God begins a series of questions that we're going to look at over the next few weeks. Questions like this, it's paraphrased. Hey, Job, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? because I don't remember seeing you there. And Job, do you remember, did you determine how much water the oceans would hold? And Job, did you set the time that the sun would rise? Job, have you comprehended the vastness of the earth? Do you know, Job, how many snowflakes are scheduled to fall on the earth? Job, do you know how light travels? Do you determine the course of water? Job, do you have the power to move constellations? And so God asks these questions about the details of the universe around Job and around us. And here's what becomes clear. God knows what we don't. God understands what we can't. And as we look at the universe, all the details and the intricacies of the universe do not indict God as an indifferent or apathetic or out-of-control God. Instead, they reveal a God who is involved in and very much in control of our universe. So let's imagine it this way. Let's imagine heaven. In heaven, there's a control room. I'm just going to be imaginative with me and envision this. So there's a control room in heaven, and in this control room, there's all kinds of gauges, like all kinds. And these controls are set to exactly where they should be. There are hundreds of dials and gauges, and they're set exactly right where they need to be so that life can exist on this planet. Now, if God invites you into the heavenly control room, like, you don't want to do this. You don't want to trip and land on one of these gauges, right? You mess some things up, because if you do, you could throw off the possibility of life on our planet just by a small turn of any of those hundreds of dials, because they're all set and finely tuned exactly right. It couldn't have happened by chance. Life here couldn't have happened by chance. Conservatively, it's been estimated that these dials being set correctly by chance, all these dials, the odds are 1 part in 100 million, billion. It's like 10 to 53 zillion or zeros. It's a lot. The probability that everything in our life and this earth happened by chance. One scientist tried to help us out, kind of make sense of this number, and he said, picture it this way. Picture a bullseye on our planet, a bullseye that is a trillionth of an inch in diameter. That's pretty small. You can't really see that here. So it's smaller than an atom. And let's just say you get a dart and you throw it randomly at this target. The chances of the dart landing on that bullseye, which is a trillionth of an inch in diameter, the chances of that are greater than the dials of our universe being set the way they are for life to exist on our planet. This didn't happen by chance. And so this is sometimes called a theological argument for the existence of God. And the theological argument is simply an argument from design. The theological argument would say that design demands a designer. And just as you would never get into a car or log onto a computer and assume that the car and the computer came to be by accident, you would never look at the design of the universe and assume that it was by accident. Or imagine it this way. Imagine taking your kids to Mount Rushmore. I took a family trip a couple years back to Mount Rushmore. Amazing place if you've never been. It's a fantastic experience. And so you go there and you look, and you're at Mount Rushmore, and there's these 4 presidents that are carved into the mountain, right? And you wouldn't say to your kids, hey, isn't that an incredible coincidence? What are the odds? What are the odds that the 4 faces of our 4 presidents have been carved in this mountain by naturally? No, I mean, you would immediately know that someone created those. Someone carved those from the mountain. A child would know someone did that. It was on purpose. And so as we look at the universe, it is infinitely more complex, and it is infinitely more ordered than the car or a computer or Mount Rushmore. And all this points to a designer who designed all of this. So what does that mean? It means that in moments like these, we have confidence that God is in control. And though we live in a fallen world where the virus of sin has spread throughout the system, we are confident that God is in control and He is working things together for good. We are confident that His hand is on the dials. So I want us to look at just a few of these dials together. One dial would be called the location dial. And on the location dial, it has a lot to do with the location of Earth in context of the sun, right? That is, if the planet Earth was just 5% closer to the sun, then we would suffer the same fate as Venus. It would be like 900 degrees on this planet, which is, that's if it's a dry heat, right? It's pretty hot, right? That's hot. I know my hand burns at like 350 in the oven. So if the Earth was just 10 to 20% further from the sun, then we would have the same fate as Mars, and things would freeze over. Think about the Earth in relation to the sun, not just with distance, but size. The sun is 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth, 1,000,000 times bigger. So you can literally put 1.3 million Earths inside the sun. Here's where that matters. If the sun were a bit smaller, let's say the sun was, say, 90% of this size, then the Earth would have to be closer to the sun in order for us to survive. But if we got closer to the sun, the gravitational pull of the sun would lock our planet into place, and half the Earth would scorch and be lifeless, and the other half would be frozen or dead. We wouldn't spin because we'd be too close to the sun. So there's all kinds of details, these fine-tuned dials. And we could talk about the dial called gravity. And if that dial were off even slightly, we would cease to exist. Stars would become too big or too small. The moon would become an issue. Like, the moon is precisely the right size in distance from the Earth. If the moon moved closer to the Earth by a fifth, just a fifth, then twice a day we would have tidal waves 35 to 55 feet high, covering the Earth. Twice a day. Considering a dial called the crust of the Earth. If the crust of the Earth were thicker or thinner, it would throw off the magnetic fields. And if the Earth's magnetic fields were weaker, our planet would be devastated by radiation. If the magnetic field were stronger, our planet would be devastated by electromagnetic storms all day long. And don't forget about the atmosphere dial. It's kind of important. We need to breathe it. The atmosphere dial, of course, is this protective blanket that surrounds the Earth. And it's made up, if you remember, it's made up of nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. But what's so intricate about this is it's the exact right balance of gases. If one of those gases were even off a little, it would create either a severe greenhouse effect or we'd become bombarded by cosmic radiation. Consider the dial labeled rotation. The rotation of our planet. Our planet Earth, it rotates on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour. And we're orbiting the sun at 70,000 miles an hour. And there are times when the sun comes close to the Earth, and there are times when the Earth starts to spin faster, so it won't be drawn too close to the sun. There are times when the Earth gets further away from the sun, and the Earth slows down. So that we still have these seasonal changes to keep the right distance from the sun. And if you think about the Earth rotating, it gets off a straight line by 1/9 of an inch every 18 miles. So every 18 miles, it gets off 1/9 of an inch. But what's unbelievable is if it diverted from its axis, from its course, just 1/8 of an inch every 18 miles, we would be too close to the sun, and we would be incinerated. If it diverted from its course 1/10 of an inch every 18 miles, we would be too far from the sun, and things would freeze over. Now look, there are all kinds of these dials like this. There are dozens of them. There are hundreds of them. I've heard someone try to explain these dials by saying, hey, it is unlikely, but these things happen by chance. These dials happen by chance. And so you could look at one of these dials and you could say, hey, the chance of that dial being set exactly right is about 1 in 10 million. It's unlikely, but it happens. It's like the odds of winning the lottery. 1 in 10 million. But somebody wins the lottery, right? It does happen. Okay, I'll give you that. But let's say that someone goes out and wins the lottery 2 times in a row. I mean, that's pretty lucky, right? To win the lottery twice. I've read stories about that. Let's say they go out and they win the lottery, and then they win it again the next day, and the next day, and the next day for a week. You might start thinking, well, something's going on here, right? But let's say they go out and they win the lottery 200 times in a row. You start to wonder, is there more to this than luck? More to it than chance? And these are the numbers that we're talking about when we're talking about the dials of our universe. And so it reveals a God who is very much in control. He's very much active in the control of our universe. The father of rocket science, Dr. Werner von Braun, came to this conclusion. He said, as I became exposed to the law and order of the universe, I was literally humbled by its unerring perfection. I became convinced that there must be a divine intent behind it all. He goes on to say, my experience with science led me to God. But must we really light a candle to see the sun? In other words, we could talk about these dials. We could go through the great length and discuss the scientific discoveries, but must we really light a candle to see the sun? I mean, isn't it obvious? And this is what David proclaims in Psalm 19. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day, they continue to speak. Night after night, they make him known. They speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard. Yet their message has gone throughout the earth, and their words to all the world. If you will, in the middle of everything that's happening, step outside one night. Look up into the sky. God is shouting to you a message. He is powerful. That's his message when you look up at the sky. He is in control. And things right now may feel like they're spinning out of control, just as sure as our earth is tilted on the 23.5 degree axis and spinning 1,000 miles an hour. Like that's what it might feel like in your life right now, that your life is just spinning that fast and you're tilted. But God's hand's on the dial. He's got it under control. And there are all kinds of evidence that we could point to, all kinds of evidence that demonstrates God is in control. And I think the problem that we have with this whole idea is probably the same problem Job had. It's not necessarily whether or not God is in control, is that we don't really like how he's controlling things. Isn't that right? If it was up to us, if we were in that room, our hands were on the dials, and we would change some things pretty quickly, right? We'd do some things differently. But here's what we're going to discover in the next few weeks. And there's so much comfort in this. There's so much comfort that we worship a God that is so much bigger than we are. That he sees what we can't see. He knows what we don't know. Should he somehow reveal the answers to us and let us see the plan that is unfolding throughout history, we wouldn't be able to understand the plan. We wouldn't be able to comprehend it. And there's something very comforting about worshiping a God who's that big and that in control. So my prayer for you, my prayer for me during these strange times that we're in, would be we finally realize that we are not the ones in control. And my prayer is that as you realize that, as you recognize this in your life, that we would see God clearly of who he is, maybe for the first time. Because at the end of Job, at the end of his story in chapter 42, after he's gone through all the pain, all the suffering, and after he has sat and listened to God ask him all these questions, Job prays, and he says to God, God, my ears have heard of you before all of this, but now my eyes have seen you. Something happened to Job. Something happened to him. His world fell apart, and he went from hearing about God to seeing God. He went from knowing about God to knowing God. And it changed his relationship with God. And that is my prayer for all of us, that in the midst of this, we would know God in a way that we've never known before. Stephen Canaster is a scientist, and he points out that in 1992, there was a Hubble photograph that was taken, and it answered the question of what is at the center of our galaxy. So for years, scientists correctly speculated that at the center of our galaxy was this black hole. And the black hole, of course, is this region of space which is a gravitational field so powerful that nothing, including light, can escape its pull. And so Hubble took a picture of the center of our galaxy from 31 million light years away. And here's what they had. This was what came up at the center of our galaxy. And he says, what you're looking at here is two dust rings circling the nucleus. That's what that is, two dust rings circling a nucleus of a black hole. And really, you know what I'm looking at? It looks a lot like a cross to me. But the reality is the cross represents a time in history where God seemed most out of control. It may be coincidence, maybe. But when Jesus was on that cross, it felt like God had lost control of everything. His son is being nailed to the cross. It seems like that all the evidence that you would need, that he's out of control. And before the cross, the disciples just believed Jesus. They followed Jesus, but that They couldn't see Jesus. They didn't see Jesus yet. Mary just couldn't quite understand, couldn't quite see him. But the pain of life when he is on that cross, it fills their eyes with tears. And sometimes we see God more clearly through tear-filled eyes. And so as the Son of God hung on the cross, there is this very clear message that is being sent out. He is in control. And it may just be that God's very purpose and plan is unfolding exactly in the moment things seem most out of control. His hand is on the dial. So I wonder what God is removing in your life right now so that you can see him more clearly. I wonder if some of you have experienced loss, maybe not the same degree as Job, but it sure feels like it. And things are just around you have just kind of fallen apart. And increasingly, you're not sure how they're going to get back together, get put back together again. And maybe like Job, you started off worshiping and putting your hope and confidence in God, but as time passes, you've begun to ask him questions and you're waiting for him to answer. But I think God has some questions for you because he wants you to know that he knows, that he sees. He sees what you can't. He understands what you don't. And that means we can put our trust in him, even when we don't understand or can make sense of it. And so if this is who God is, if God is all-powerful, if God is in control, if his hand is on the dials, then the right thing for us to do is pray a very simple prayer. It's just to pray, God, I need you. I need you. I can't do this on my own. I'm dependent on you. I need your help. It's one of the most spiritual things you can do is to humble yourself before God and just confess the truth that you need him in your life. That's it. Let's pray. God, I thank you. I thank you for the fact that you are at work in our lives and in our universe, that even when we don't see it, even when we can't feel it, that you are at work. I thank you, God, that your hand is on the dial. I thank you that our perspective is very limited, but your perspective is eternal. And you're working things out to accomplish your ultimate purpose. You're allowing some difficult things temporarily to accomplish eternal good. And God, I pray for everyone listening to this, that in this moment, they wouldn't waste this time. They wouldn't waste the pain or the struggle. I pray, God, that they would see you in the pain and the struggle. And when they see you, when they get a glimpse of you, I pray that together we would just cry out and acknowledge our need for you in our life. So God, we thank you. We thank you for forever demonstrating your power, for your control, your sovereignty, and your love for us when you sent Jesus to die on the cross for our sins. God, I pray that nothing could escape that kind of love, that kind of sacrifice through Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.